Me from Newton and getting me here safely. So thank you. I also want to thank a former student of mine, Ben Reese, who's here. And I tell you, I was kind of blown away. You know, we suffered through COVID together. He was my student at the time, and I was just terribly impressed by Ben's common sense and his kind of manly courage in basically not being bullied by a lot of, you know, bureaucratic overkill, right, during the COVID thing. So anyway, he's a great man. And I also want to acknowledge another old friend who's here, Daniel Perry, who brought me a bottle of limoncello, which is this great Italian liqueur that's, you know, made from lemons. And he labeled it anesthesia because I apologize for sitting down, but I have my leg in a kind of straight leg brace, and I also apologize for wearing sweatpants and a sweatsuit to this event. But the fact of the matter is only the sweatpants can cover the leg brace, which I'm supposed to wear 24/7. Tomorrow morning at 7:30, I'm being operated on to reattach, hopefully, my quadriceps muscle to my right knee. So anyway, any prayers you can offer would be much appreciated and reciprocated. But I came to this subject of the universal call to holiness, that all are called to holiness. I came to it for several reasons. One is, since high school, I've been a member of Opus Dei, which is a church organization. Technically, it's called, under canon law, it's called a personal prelature. But Opus Dei is dedicated to the pursuit of holiness through daily work and the fulfillment of the Christian's ordinary duties. Indeed, the founder of Opus Dei, who I knew, actually, who died in 1975, was canonized in 2002 by now St. John Paul II. I was present for that. But at the day after his canonization, John Paul II called St. Jose Maria, the founder of Opus Dei, called him the saint of ordinary life, right? Because that was his message. And even though sort of my day job, or my paying job is being a constitutional law professor at UMass Law School. By the way, I know it's kind of a secret, but the truth of the matter is it's a very cushy job. I work 24/7, 24 weeks a year, 7 hours a week in the classroom, right? And that's kind of on the high side. The 24 weeks a year is definitely true, right? It's 12 weeks for the 2 semesters I get summers off. So it's, as you can see, it's kind of backbreaking work. But anyway, I also have a degree in canon law, which is the law of the Catholic Church, which I studied, which I got in Rome in the mid-1980s, studying in what became the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, right? So I actually know Rome pretty well. I don't know how well I know canon law, but, it's like that and $5 will buy you the Wall Street Journal, But in any case, in studying canon law, I was more interested in it from a historical perspective, in as much as it's probably the first modern legal system in an interesting way from the Middle Ages, right? It was modern then. But I actually wasn't interested in the kind of meat and potatoes church law issues, and by that I mean annulment cases for marriage, which is kind of the bulk of the work, I think, that canon lawyers perform, or even worse, priestly sex abuse cases. That's the church's penal or criminal law. And unfortunately, I think we've seen that in both these areas, there's plenty of work for canon lawyers to do, but I guess my view is these are dealing with dysfunctional situations, right? Sad to say. It's, broken marriages or worse, broken priestly vows, I think, right? And I didn't want to get into it. It's just like, this is depressing to me. So instead, I wrote my dissertation on the history of the canonization process, right? Because ever since 1170, when Pope Alexander III reserved canonization of saints to the Pope, right, in Rome, there's been a kind of centralized saint-making process, which is a legal process, right, as to having a person declared a saint. Now, unlike marriage annulment cases or priestly sex abuse cases, this deals with the church's success stories, right? It deals with people who have lived the faith to a heroic degree oftentimes, or been martyred for the faith. And these are inspiring people, right? These are real, these are the success stories of the church. That if we live what the church teaches, right, that, we'll get to heaven, right? And only saints actually get to heaven, right? Maybe after purgatory or whatever, but I'm saying we have to be saints, okay? So, I also, I suppose the other thing, and I'll talk about this more later, but that, I actually met, I guess is probably the right word. I met a couple of canonized saints, right? I met St. John Paul II while he was Pope in Rome, because that's when I was studying in Rome. And actually in 2014, when he was canonized 9 years after he died, I went to Rome for that because I really didn't want to miss it, because it was a huge thing. There were millions of people, a lot of Poles descending on Rome for that occasion. The amazing thing is, given that crowd, a lot of people didn't get any closer to St. Peter's than the Tiber River, which is pretty far away because of the crowds. But I managed to, or the people I was with, including Chris Slattery, who I'll talk about later, we managed to get in St. Peter's Square, not just in the square, but between the obelisk and the main altar, right, where Pope Francis was presiding, but there was also Pope Benedict was there, as Pope Emeritus. So it was. I've been at his canonization. I was also, as I said, at the canonization in 2002 of Saint Jose Maria, whom I also have met. Right. So I've kind of known in some sense canonized saints, but probably more relevant to this, evening's talk is that I know a couple of people, both younger than I, who died in this country, and they could be canonized saints, right? Ruth McCulloch and Chris Slattery, right? Now, more on that later, but my point is, I feel extremely fortunate to have known these people, right? Because they're luminous, right? They're extraordinarily attractive. They were very joyful people. That's the other thing, right? They knew how to have fun. They were fully alive, very human, but also they were deeply supernatural, and I'll talk more about that. But the other reason why I'm talking about this subject of everyone being called to holiness, and by the way, think about that for a minute. It means everyone is called to holiness by God, right? That everyone is a child of God, made in God's image and likeness, right? And everyone is called to holiness. Now this includes, interestingly enough, I think it isn't just the baptized, although, first it's the baptized, right? Because we're specially configured to Christ by baptism and confirmation, but it's everyone. Everyone is, every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. Every human being is a child of God, right? So that means everyone is called to holiness. Now think about that for a minute. It means, the pro-abortion feminist is called to holiness, right? Or the, gay rights advocate for LGBTQRSTUV, is called to holiness, right? Or the porn star is called to holiness, right? Which is pretty interesting, right? If you think about it, because it has to do with how do we relate to these people, right? Who are maybe far from God, far from the church, far from, Christian morality, maybe even, right? How do we view them, right? And my point is simply that, our faith says we have to love everyone, right? Love everyone. Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who persecute you and calumniate you. I don't know that we necessarily appreciate how radical that is. It means that we can never be haters, right? That we can't just dismiss portions of the population because they're sinners, right? I mean, this is one of the interesting things about the parable of the wheat and the weeds, right? That our Lord offers, right? It's like, the wheat is growing and, somebody comes and sows weeds among the wheat, and the people come and say, let's separate the two, right? And the master tells them, no, wait till the end. Wait till the harvest, and then we'll separate them, right? And I think this is a pretty clear warning to us that our church, right, the chosen, the elect, there are saints among us, but there are also sinners among us, right? And somehow separating between the saints and the sinners, that's God's job when people die, right? That's not, in a certain sense, that's not our job, right? I don't think. Otherwise we become a kind of puritanical church, right? Where only the pure belong. But the point is, I think we don't have to have much self-knowledge to realize that, we're sinners, and therefore we don't want to have a church that only has the perfect, because it's going to be a really small church getting smaller and smaller, right? So what I'm saying is, people complain about Pope Francis or this and that, right? And I'm just saying, don't be too puritanical, right? That's all. That it's like we have to have room for the sinners, right? We have to have a way for sinners to come back. And you don't do that by just condemning them and judging them all the time. At some level, I'll talk about this later, but we have to befriend people, right? I think we have to offer pretty much everyone our sincere friendship, right? Even if they don't respond, right? Or maybe even especially if they don't respond. So, final reason for this topic is that when I was in grade school in the early 1960s, the Vatican II was meeting, right? In some ways, this was like the greatest event of the Catholic Church of the 20th century. One of its key documents was called Lumen Gentium, which was issued in 1964 when I was 13 years old. And one of the chapters in that dogmatic constitution of the church, chapter 5, was entitled The Universal Call to Holiness. Right? So before this official document of the church dealt with the different types of members of the church, that they're lay people, they're priests, they're religious, they're bishops, they're cardinals, there's the Pope, there's a sort of whole hierarchy, right? Before it deals with that, it stresses the idea that everyone is called to holiness, right? And Paul VI, who was Pope at the time, and who was later canonized himself, so it's Saint Paul VI, he called this teaching of Vatican II, right, that all are called to holiness, he called it the central teaching of Vatican II, right? In other words, this is like the most important message of Vatican II. Vatican II had a lot of important messages, one of which I'm very appreciative of, which is the church finally recognized the principle of religious freedom, right? Because up until the 1960s, the standard kind of prevailing Catholic view was that unless you belong to the Catholic Church, and were subject to the authority of the Pope, you could not be saved. And the ideal social arrangement was a kind of officially Catholic state, right? Which, like Sharia law, would in effect enforce legally, right, our moral beliefs as Catholics, right, on everybody, whether or not they were Catholic. Now, what I'm saying is, at Vatican II, the Church formally recognized, maybe somewhat late in the game, this principle: oh no, people's religious beliefs are sacred, right, and they're a matter of conscience, and therefore they're entitled to respect, right? And the ideal state is not an officially Catholic state, right, although they don't say that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But in effect, it allowed the American experience in religious freedom, right, which has pluses and negatives, to be respected, right? That somehow the Church grows not through coercion, but through persuasion, right? And even if you're Catholic, it's possible that you come to, conscientiously maybe, that you come to the conclusion that, the Church is inadequate, in which case you should follow your conscience, right? Assuming your conscience is well-formed, right? So anyway, what I'm saying is that was a long overdue development at Vatican II, which as a constitutional law professor, I'm very much in favor of, because it makes Catholicism compatible with our constitutional system, really, in this kind of, liberal constitutional system. Anyway, it's kind of beside the point. But anyway, this point about all being called to holiness reminds me of a statement made by a French writer earlier in the 20th century, which was that this is a quote: "Life holds only one tragedy, ultimately not to have been a saint." Right? That the one tragedy is not to have been a saint. Right? Last weekend I had the privilege or whatever of seeing this new movie, Cabrini, which I think is a very good movie, although some people have criticized it, but it's an extremely well done movie. In some ways it reminded me of Godfather Part 2 with its scenes from the Lower East Side and Little Italy, at the turn of the century between the 19th and 20th centuries, right? So it's a little bit like Godfather Part 2, but it's very well filmed, very well acted, and it deals with the life, or really the mission, of St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, who is not that well known among Americans. She should be well known because she was the first American citizen to be proclaimed to be canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church, which happened in 1946, after the Second World War, when Pius XII was Pope. Right? Anyway, it's a very attractive treatment of this nun's mission, which was to minister to immigrants and to poor people and establish orphanages and hospitals. But in doing so, she had to fight against the prejudice that a lot of Americans had in those days, and maybe even still have to a certain degree, against Italians, right? But not just against Italians, particularly against feisty Italian women, right? And so it portrays her fights in the church and in the larger society, with the mayor of New York. And one interesting fact about her canonization in 1946 is there are a number of American, even though this is like a great occasion for the church in the United States, a number of American bishops would not go to the canonization of Mother Cabrini because they remembered Mother Cabrini, and they basically had fought with Mother Cabrini, right? Trying to keep her in her place. And she would always appeal to Rome or, kind of come up, to minister to people in need. It's an incredible story, really. And the film does a good job of portraying this, right? This heroic aspect. Anyway, I don't know why I'm getting into this other than to say sanctity is really interesting, right? It's like these are really interesting people. And it's good to know, it's good to know something about these saints. So the question is, okay, everybody is called to holiness. How do we grab onto that, or how do we live that, right? And I would say the key thing, of course, is intimacy with Jesus Christ, right? That we have to follow Christ, not just follow Christ, not even just imitate Christ. We have to, in a certain sense, become Christ, right? The way St. Paul in one of his epistles says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, right? So this identification with Christ, I think, is at the heart of holiness, right? Which means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is having a personal relationship with Jesus, right? And I think that's expressed, above all, in some ways, in personal prayer. And particularly when life hits you with hardballs or whatever, you experience suffering or pain or setbacks or family whatever, unemployment, all these things. Precisely in those painful, difficult moments, turn to Jesus, right, personally. I suppose the other thing to think about is, and related, is the greatest commandments, right? Love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, but understand this interesting qualification to that, which is, this was the old law. This summed up the law and the prophets of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, right? The new commandment, the new law that Jesus gave us was much more than loving your neighbor as yourself. It's a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you, right? And this will men know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Meaning, the gift of self to other people to the point of destruction, to the point of dying for them, right? Because that's, greater love than this no man has than he lay down his life for his friends, right? One of the interesting things Pope Francis has done with the cause of canonization, it's a kind of reform, and I totally approve of it. It's traditionally there have been two ways of proving holiness, that you're a saint. Either the way of heroic virtue, that you lived all the virtues to a heroic degree, which is tough, or martyrdom, right, that you died for the faith. Now that also has to be accompanied by proof of a miracle. Okay, actually two miracles, one for beatification, one for canonization, right? And a miracle is a scientifically inexplicable, usually cure, right, that there is no explanation for, right, scientific. It's very interesting, the whole business of miracles, right? Because there are miracles, but in any case, the two traditional ways have been heroic virtue or martyrdom plus miracles, right? The new way is those who gave their life to save others, right? The person who dives into the swelling river to rescue some child who's drowning, right? And in the process, maybe rescues the child, maybe doesn't succeed, but drowns him or herself, right? That person has given his life out of love for another, the way Christ gave his life for us. And the point is, that's a reason for canonization, right? Which is pretty interesting to me, I mean, right? So everybody who gives his life to save others, right, is a saint, right? And I was talking to Mike earlier about what's become my favorite movie, which is Hacksaw Ridge, about a Medal of Honor winner during the Second World War who was a Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objector who was there as a medic at the Battle of Okinawa. And basically the point was, even without a rifle or a gun or anything to defend himself, he single-handedly saved the lives of I don't know, 75 of his fellow soldiers, right, throughout the night, lowering them down a cliff one by one. It's a true story, and it's an incredible story. But this guy was clearly a saint. I mean, I think, right, even though he was a Seventh-day Adventist, right? It was so anyway, I don't want to get into that. What's that? Movie is Hacksaw Ridge. It's a terrific movie. I love it. I don't know. It's got great scenes of the Battle of Okinawa, which is one hell of a battle. Okay. All right, so like I say, I think holiness is this intimacy with Christ. Now, how do we achieve that, right? There's a very good book by a local priest, Father Roger Landry, whom I'm sure some of you know, but I've known Roger since he was a student in college, right? And he's an old friend, and I know his parents very well, who are wonderful people. And Roger has always been kind of a phenomenon, right? So, but I knew him before he entered the seminary, but he's written a book that's a very good book called Plan of Life, which goes through some of the practices that pretty much saints have done to cultivate this life of union, this intimacy with our Lord, right? Things like, daily mass, communion, praying the rosary, right? Obviously, confession, the sacrament of confession is very important, I think, because we're all sinners, right? And we need forgiveness, I think. And, I think now, my sense of it is, it's actually not that hard to commit serious sin in this culture, right? It's just a click or two away on the internet, honestly, in terms of like porn and things like this. I mean, I'm just, so, but that's, I'm saying, okay, we're not perfect, and none of us are perfect, we're struggling, but I'm saying we need to be forgiven in the sacrament of penance, right, of reconciliation. Anyway, so all of that's part of it. So all of this is kind of on the holiness side, but there's another side of the coin which has to do with apostolate, right, bringing others to Christ. Because if we are sincere friends of Christ, we want to share that friendship with other people, right? And I think this is extremely important, right? And it relates actually to the second commandment, love your neighbor, right? And so this starts with our family responsibilities, right? As a husband, as a father, as a brother, as a son, right? In other words, your family situation has got to be, to the extent possible, like St. Joseph, that we're known for loving our family, right? I think, and that might be, of course, a real challenge at times, obviously. Okay, so, but I would say another thing that I want to mention is the importance of friendship, right? Sometimes I'm a little concerned with some of the younger generation. I'm kind of getting older myself, which means wherever I go, the first thing I ask is, "Where's the bathroom?" Kind of. But so don't get old, all right? But anyway, is sometimes I see among younger people this idea that somehow they can't be friends with somebody unless they agree about everything, politics, religion, what have you. And I'm saying, no, absolutely not. That friendship is an intrinsic good, right? And the fact that you disagree with a friend, fine, right? I mean, I think we've all sort of experienced this somehow, that sometimes we hit it off personally with people that are completely different from us, and they're, think totally opposite ways, There's a local radio personality, Marcus, I forget his last name, I should know it, but anyway, he's a very good friend, but we had disagreed, I had him in class about 10 years ago. We disagreed about everything, political, religious, but we were friends, right? And I'm just saying that's a wonderful thing. I'm thinking like in my profession, the fact that Justice Antonin Scalia was best of friends with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is incredible. The only thing they had in common was they both basically went to, were New Yorkers, and they both went to Harvard Law School, right? But other than that, in terms of politics, ideology, religion, she was a liberal Jewish feminist, and he was a conservative Catholic, Republican, really. So they didn't have anything intellectually in common particularly, but they liked to go to the opera with their spouses together and go to vacation to India. There's a famous photo of Justice Scalia on top of an elephant, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg by his side. And I'm just saying, that's a wonderful thing, actually, right? That these people can be friends. And it forces you to think about things from somebody else's perspective, right? And maybe softens their views, maybe softens your views, but I think that's a good thing. But so we've experienced that we hit it off with people sometimes we disagree with. And I say by the same token, sometimes we've experienced a situation in which people that we agree with about virtually everything, we don't actually hit it off with, right? It's like the classic thing is that senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz is a guy who, his positions on things are virtually identical with mine, but I can't stand Ted Cruz, right? There's something about him that gives me the creeps, right? So, and that's, maybe it's my problem, I don't know, but I'm just saying this happens, okay? But my larger point is just the intrinsic value of friendship. It's really good to be friends with people, and we should try to be friends with as many people as possible, right, I think, and always have an open offer of friendship to people. Okay. And I think that's an important way in which, in effect, the faith is spread. Not that we are instrumentalizing the friendship to bring somebody to the church, right? But it will have that effect over time, right? If they see how happy we are, how virtuous we are, whatever, right? Or even how humble we are when we, fall short of our goals. Okay, so let me talk now about the two saints, or at least saints in the making that I've known. Let me start with Ruth Pakulik. She died 25 years ago at age like 46 or 47. She had 7 children, one of whom died a crib death. And just to give you some idea of, let me explain. Recently, in the past few months, I've had several conversations with the Vicar General of the Diocese of Worcester, Monsignor Richard Reedy, who I've known for decades, right? But he also was a good friend of Ruth Pakulik. And my conversations with him were about how do we start a cause of canonization for Ruth, right? Just to give you some idea of her impressive story, I don't know if you all have heard about Michael Novak, but he's a famous sort of Catholic writer and intellectual of the 20th century. He died about, 10 or 15 years ago. But there's a book that came out about 15 years ago with the interesting title, The Appalling Strangeness of the Mercy of God, the story of Ruth Pakulik, convert, mother, pro-life activist. And it's mainly, the introductory chapter is her husband's account of Ruth's life. But then the rest of the book are her letters and her talks that were gotten off of her computer, right, after she died. And it's an incredible read. I'm just saying here's Michael Novak. I have never read a more beautiful and touching book. A book about the joyous life and overpowering death and grief and joy. Michael and Ruth Pakulik's account of love and grief towers head and shoulders above the justly acclaimed accounts of C.S. Lewis in A Grief Observed and Sheldon Vanauken in A Severe Mercy. Throughout, I felt in my heart that Ruth is a marvelous saint for our times. Okay? So what I'm saying is, I think the Catholic Diocese of Worcester is about to open the cause for Ruth 25 years after she died, right? And it'll be the first time that Worcester has had a cause of canonization, right? So this is kind of interesting. And anyway, just to give you some idea of her accomplishments, in the spring of 1970, she was originally from New Jersey, and in 1975, she graduated from high school, a public high school, straight A student who played oboe, violin, and bass drum, was chosen for the All-State and All-Eastern choirs, played field hockey, and produced, directed, and acted in numerous plays and musicals, right? So she graduates from high school with honors and an A average. Then, in that fall, she began her undergraduate studies at Harvard. I think the point is to realize that at the time, she considered herself an atheist and also pro-abortion, okay? And this is largely because of the culture she was raised in, okay? But in 1976, the school year 1976 to 77, while serving as a TA, as a sophomore in college, she was a TA for a course on cosmology, she met Michael Pakalik, a fellow sophomore taking the class, right? And basically, they both regarded themselves as atheists at the time they first met, but both were also searching for knowledge of the truth. So I remember, like, one of the things Ruth talks about in her letters is she was taking a course at Harvard from Perry Miller, I believe, on the Puritans in New England, right? And she explains how it was that in their first winter, I don't know, half of them died, and the other half were busy kind of ministering to their needs and taking care of the sick, right? And she said that her classmates' reaction to this was, ooh, this is horrible, right? This is a horrible story. And whereas Ruth said, was impressed with the heroism of these people, right? She said, I want to live like that, right? It's like, in the midst of incredible suffering and death and deprivation, right, to have the heroism, right, to minister to the sick and the dying, right? I mean, it's just an example, but so both her and her future husband, Michael, began to read the Bible regularly, prayed, and towards the end of the year, they looked to join a fellowship or church with other Christians, and they basically, attended Protestant churches, right? But during their last semester at Harvard, Ruth and Michael were on the brink of deciding to become Catholic, right? So they began attending early Mass at St. Paul's in Harvard Square before attending the Sunday service at their own congregation, First Church Congregational on the Cambridge Common, right? So actually, they belong to the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is sort of an ecumenical but sort of Protestant, verging on fundamentalist group. And anyway, they decided to bring in some InterVarsity campus minister from another city who would argue with a recent convert teaching at Boston College, right? With the idea that somehow Catholicism would be refuted once and for all. The problem was that the recent convert from Boston College was none other than Peter Kraft, right? So he basically slaughtered the InterVarsity Fellowship person, and of course Ruth and Michael became Catholic. Anyway, it's a long story. Eventually she ends up being pro-life and heading up Mass Citizens for Life for 4 years, and debating the pro-life issue on plenty of college campuses. And she ends up getting breast cancer and eventually dying of breast cancer. But her story is incredible. I mean, and her writing, like last month's Magnificat, I don't know if people are familiar with Magnificat, this daily misled, I guess. Well, they have a daily spiritual reading. Well, the spiritual reading was an excerpt from Ruth's book. And this is something that she just wrote in a letter to somebody, right? But it's totally public, it's incredibly well put and eloquent and deep. Okay, the other, I'm sort of running out of time here, so let me just mention Chris Slattery, okay? And I'll just quickly read from this recent article about him. He died on November 22nd, last November 22nd. He was a longtime pro-life activist. He lived in New York City. He passed away after a courageous battle with 2 different cancers. He was 68 years old. Prior to his pro-life work, he worked in advertising, right? In fact, I first met him when he was sold ads for The Economist magazine, right? But he had success counseling abortion-minded women to, go through with their pregnancies, and decided to dedicate himself full-time to that activity. So he founded a pregnancy center network, Expectant Mother Care, with 14 locations in the New York City area. So this is like the abortion capital of the world, having these crisis pregnancy centers, right? So he was under constant legal and financial threat from the governor of New York, from the Attorney General of New York, from the mayor of New York City. To me, it's inconceivable the amount of pressure he was under. I could never in a million years do what he did. But it just bounced off Chris. I mean, he's wonderful. He was more concerned with saving lives. And the estimate now is that 43,000 lives were saved as a result of his pro-life work, right? Talking women, entering abortion clinics out of having abortions. And he did things like, have ultrasound testing available in mobile units, and anyway, Chris is an incredible hero. I mean, everything I was amazed after he died, this incredible outpouring of testimonials of people about Chris. And, one of his favorite sayings was, be bold, be bold, be bold, but not too bold. Which is kind of amusing, because it's like, be bold, that's the cardinal virtue of fortitude or courage, right? Which he thought was really important. But it was also prudence, right? Sort of good judgment, knowing that, you can't, whatever, right? You have to, weigh the situation. I mean, before kind of coming back strongly to the Catholic faith, Chris Slattery, when he was a student at Boston College in the 1970s, was the leader of the streak-in, when people used to run around campus naked. That was Chris. Chris organized that at Boston College before he kind of got religious. But I'm saying he was a great figure. So anyway, I guess I'll just shut up because I've kind of overextended my time. I'm sorry. Yeah, you okay? I mean, we should probably move on to adoration, right? Or
yeah.
With the most important thing.
Does anybody have any questions for Dwight before we move on to adoration?
Yes.
I would like to ask you if you know how many saints
Have been canonized from the United States? I don't know exactly the number, but my guess is maybe 20, 25. There have been a fair number lately, saints like St. Marianne Cope, who accompanied Father Damien, St. Damien of Molokai, in dealing with the lepers on Hawaii. Hers is an incredible story of heroism. I mean, she was there for 40 years, right, ministering to lepers. I mean, and a very beautiful woman, right? But there are a number of interesting American saints, and the first canonized one was Mother Cabrini. Anyway, what's that? 1946 is the first American citizen to be canonized. Yeah, so it's a fairly recent history. Mother Seton, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, was canonized in 1976. St. John Neumann, the first male American citizen to be canonized, was canonized in 1976, the bicentennial year. We don't have, I mean, Bishop Sheen is venerable. Bishop Sheen should be beatified, but a hold has been placed on it by the Vatican. But they proved heroic virtue and also the miracle, right? So there's no reason why he would be the first American-born male to be beatified, to be canonized for heroic virtue. Because a few years ago, an American named Stanley Rother was beatified as a martyr, right? He went from Oklahoma to Latin America, where he was killed in Guatemala, and he's been beatified as a martyr. But there's been no American-born male who's been beatified yet, right? So everybody you all can be the first. I don't know.